Magnolia Voss moved through the sepia-toned nightmare with the grim determination of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be clean, to be cool, to be anything but tired. Her world had shrunk to the agonizing cycle of hauling water from the depleted creek, her shoulders screaming in protest, her palms raw and bleeding inside her worn leather gloves. The water she carried was life itself, a precious, dwindling currency paid out in shallow troughs to the listless cattle, their ribs beginning to show like the bars of a cage. She worked from the first hint of light to the last, her father's silhouette a stationary monument of frustration on the porch, staring at the horizon as if he could summon rain through sheer force of will. The ranch hands, pragmatic men who recognized a losing battle, had drifted away weeks ago, leaving only the two of them, a father and daughter stranded on an island of dust, fighting a war they were clearly losing. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful lowing of the cattle and the ceaseless, dry whisper of the wind. Then the riders came. They appeared just as the sun began to bleed into the horizon, a group of 7 men materializing from the shimmering heat haze. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that had nothing to do with friendliness. Their faces were hidden beneath the shadowed brims of pulled-low hats, their forms indistinct and menacing. Magnolia was securing the barn door when she saw them, a dark knot of intention crossing their property line. Her stomach plummeted, a cold dread seizing her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. This wasn't desperation looking for work or a meal. This was calculated predation. These were men who had already decided that taking was easier than asking. She ran for the house, her shout for her father tearing from a throat raw with dust and fear. Sterling Maddock emerged, his old rifle in hand, but the tremor in his grip betrayed him. He was a man of 50, worn down by exhaustion and defeat, facing 7 younger men whose eyes held the hard glint of resolved violence. The lead rider dismounted, his hand resting casually on the weapon at his hip. He offered no greetings, no false pleasantries. His gesture was a blunt, economic statement, a pointed finger directed at the barn, at the pitiful herd of skeletal cattle. His terms were simple, absolute. They would take half. Not a request, but a declaration. There would be no negotiation, no payment. This was survival, and they were on the winning side. Magnolia watched her father's shoulders slump, saw the rifle in his hands dip toward the ground. It was a quiet, terrible surrender. The fight drained from him visibly, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. This was the end of everything they had worked for, everything they had fought to preserve, reduced to this moment of absolute powerlessness. That was when the Apache appeared. He did not emerge from the shadows. He simply was there, a solid, silent presence materializing between Sterling and the raiders, as if he had been carved from the very air. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his long black hair a stark contrast against the faded landscape. His eyes, dark and impossibly calm, scanned the scene, assessing every man, every weapon, every possible outcome in a single sweeping glance. He carried no visible weapon, made no threatening move. He simply spoke a few low, guttural words in a language Magnolia did not understand, then repeated the command in English with a tone of absolute, unshakable certainty that brooked no argument. "Leave now." The lead raider laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and his hand moved toward his hip. What happened next was a blur of controlled, fluid motion. The Apache moved faster than thought, a strike and a twist that disarmed the man and sent him stumbling backward, clutching a useless wrist. The message was delivered not with a shout, but with terrifying efficiency. The confidence of the raiders shattered. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. After a tense, silent eternity, where the only sound was the ragged breathing of the disarmed man, they remounted, their threats thrown over their shoulders as empty as the land they left behind. Sterling Maddock stood frozen, staring at the stranger who had just single-handedly saved his home, his livelihood, his very life. Magnolia watched her father's face, seeing the shock transmute into something else, something deep and unsettling, a fanatical light of dawning purpose that made her blood run cold. 3 days later, the memory of the attack had hardened into a new kind of prison. Sterling Maddock made his announcement at dawn, as if the pale, unforgiving light would sanctify his decision. He summoned them both to the main room of the house, a space that suddenly felt claustrophobic and airless. Magnolia stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a tin coffee cup halted halfway to her lips, while her father laid out his grand design with the unshakable conviction of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment. Cale was already there, positioned near the window like a statue carved from shadow and resistance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the glass, refusing to look at her. The words that fell from Sterling's mouth were polished and heavy, rehearsed in the silent, feverish hours of the night. They were words like debt, honor, tradition, and sacred obligation. He spoke of a man's unbreakable duty to repay what he owed, of debts that transcended money or labor, of scales that could only be balanced by the ultimate offering: family, blood, marriage. With every sentence, Magnolia felt the walls of the room press inward, the air thinning until each breath was a struggle. Her father was not negotiating. He was issuing a decree. His daughter transformed in his mind from a person into a commodity, a piece of property to be honorably transferred from one man's stewardship to another's. A cold, sharp clarity cut through her shock. She set the coffee cup down on the wooden counter with a deliberate quietness, the click of tin on with the only sound challenging her father's monologue. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she felt, a single, clean word that hung in the air between them like a shard of ice. No. Sterling blinked, his features rearranging themselves into an expression of pure, uncomprehending astonishment, as if she had just spoken in a forgotten tongue. He dismissed her refusal, his voice gaining a hard, paternal edge. This was not a discussion, he stated. The man had saved everything they had, their lives, their land. He would not be remembered as a man who shirked a sacred debt. Then pay him another way, she countered, forcing her eyes to meet his, her mind racing for alternatives. Give him half the cattle when the drought breaks. Offer him work, money, anything. Anything except her body, her future, her life. His reply was a lesson on the nature of a man's honor, and she cut him off, the word no sharper and more final this time, a blade of pure defiance. She turned then to Cale, expecting to see some flicker of triumph, possession, or at least acquiescence in the stranger's face. Instead, she found a terrifying emptiness. He was staring past her, his jaw set so tight the muscle beneath his skin jumped with a rhythmic, suppressed fury, his breathing a slow, controlled exercise of a man mastering a storm of his own anger. Sterling's face hardened into the stubborn rock she knew so well. He declared his will as law. The matter was final. And then Cale spoke. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that vibrated through the tense air, devoid of all emotion, which made it all the more powerful. He stated a simple, undeniable fact. He had not asked for this. Sterling turned to him, startled by the interruption, and launched into a speech once more, detailing the bravery, the risk, the life debt that now belonged to the Apache. Cale finally looked at Magnolia, and in that single fleeting glance, a silent understanding passed between them, swift and absolute. It was a recognition of their shared predicament. They were both hostages, prisoners of the same man's unyielding pride. When Cale spoke again, his words were meant for Sterling, but they validated her own silent scream. He did not want a wife who was being traded like a horse. The comparison struck Sterling with the force of a physical blow, leaving him speechless, his mouth opening and closing without sound. A strange, fierce surge of gratitude flooded Magnolia's chest toward this stranger who had given voice to her own powerlessness. But her father was a man who built fortifications when challenged. She could see him regrouping, his eyes searching for new justifications, shoring up the walls of his decision with fresh mortar. He told them they would both come to understand in time. He spoke of honor demanding sacrifice. And then he delivered the sentence. 3 days. They would have the ceremony in 3 days. That, he said, was time enough for them to accept what must be done. The air left Magnolia's lungs in a silent rush. 3 days. He was giving them 72 hours to surrender, to bend their wills to his. She looked at Cale again, and this time he held her gaze. There was no warmth in his dark eyes, no promise of affection. But there was something else, something that kindled a small, defiant flame inside her, a shared determination, a resistance, an absolute refusal to be controlled. Her father left the room, believing the conversation was concluded. But Magnolia knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was not over. Not by a long measure. She glanced at the Apache one last time before turning away. He remained by the window, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. And in that moment, a profound realization dawned upon her, pushing back against the tide of her panic. She was not in this fight alone. She found him later by the creek, in the place where the sun turned the meager trickle of water into a stream of liquid silver. He was sitting on a flat, sun-warmed rock, his posture not one of anger, but of a deep contemplative stillness, as if the answers to unasked questions lay buried in the water's slow flow. He did not turn at the sound of her approach, but the subtle tension that corded the muscles in his shoulders told her he was acutely aware of her presence. She stopped a few paces away, maintaining a careful distance, the space between them charged with unspoken accusations and a strange, burgeoning camaraderie. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until she was the one to break it. She told him he could leave. He could simply walk away. Her father could not force him to stay. Cale's jaw tightened, his profile sharp against the bright sky. Neither, he replied with a quiet, devastating logic, could the old man force her to marry. Yet, there they both were. The simple truth of his statement settled between them like the fine dust that covered everything. Magnolia sat slowly on a nearby rock, close enough to see the tension in the long fingers that pressed against the stone he occupied. She had come out here half expecting to confront an adversary, the man who had somehow agreed to this madness. Instead, she found a fellow captive, bound by the same invisible chains. The uneasy truce was shattered the next morning by the sound of approaching horses, not the stealthy tread of raiders, but the purposeful, heavy gait of men riding with righteousness in their hearts. They came from the eastern settlements, 8 of them led by the thick-shouldered Garrett, their faces set in hard, sunburned masks of judgment as they dismounted in the yard. This was not a social call. It was an intervention. Magnolia watched from a window, her stomach tightening into a cold knot, while her father stepped out to meet them with a hospitality that was strained and thin. Cale emerged from the barn and positioned himself near its entrance, his body still and watchful, his eyes reading the threat not in drawn weapons, but in the set of their shoulders and the condescension in their stares. Garrett did not bother with preliminaries. His voice, loud and meant to carry, declared that the whole territory had heard about Sterling's arrangement and that people were not happy. Sterling's jaw set, his pride bristling as he asserted that his family matters were his own concern. Another, younger man spat back that it became everyone's concern when it set a precedent, when it threatened their standards and their traditions. Magnolia felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. She saw through their words instantly. This was not about honor or community welfare. This was plain, ugly prejudice dressed up in polite language. She stepped out onto the porch before her father could form a reply, placing herself squarely in their line of sight. Garrett's eyes shifted to her, filled with a patronizing dismissal that made her blood boil. He told her she was young, that she didn't understand the shame she would bring upon her family name, that there were good men from proper settlements who deserved her. Her reply was sharp and clear, lancing through his hypocrisy. Men, she stated, who believed they had the right to dictate who she could and could not marry. Her father tried to silence her with a warning tone, but the dam had broken. She gestured toward Cale, who stood as motionless as the barn itself, and her voice shook not with fear, but with a fierce, protective anger. She demanded to know where these concerned neighbors had been when armed men came to steal everything they owned. She declared that her father's arrangement was his own doing, but she would not stand by and let them insult the man who had saved their lives when they had done nothing. The silence that fell was electric. broken only by the shifting of hooves and the quiet intake of breath. Garrett's face flushed a dark red, his fury barely contained. He mounted his horse, throwing out a final, venomous threat aimed not just at Sterling, but directly at her, promising she would regret crossing this line. As the dust from their departure settled, Magnolia stood trembling, the adrenaline coursing through her. She turned and found Cale's gaze upon her, and for the first time, she saw something unguarded in his eyes, not just surprise, but a deep, resonant acknowledgement. In that moment, she understood the terrifying truth that had been growing inside her. She was not defending him out of mere principle or fairness. She was defending him because somewhere in the tangled mess of obligation and resistance, she had started to care what happened to him. That evening, Sterling insisted on another of his forced rituals, Cale joining them for the evening meal. The tension in the small kitchen was a physical presence, thick and smothering. Magnolia set the table with a quiet deliberation, placing 3 tin plates and forks with a care that felt like a protest. When Cale entered, he moved with a predator's wariness, as if navigating a room full of invisible tripwires. He sat across from her, his posture rigid, leaving the head of the table for Sterling. The meal commenced in a silence, broken only by the scrape of utensils against metal. Magnolia found her eyes drawn to his hands. She noticed the controlled economy of his movements, how he took only what he needed, how he seemed intensely conscious of the space he occupied, as if years of survival had taught him to make himself smaller, less intrusive. Sterling attempted to break the silence with questions about tracking and wilderness lore, topics that allowed for facts without intimacy. Cale answered with a polite brevity, offering just enough to be respectful while skillfully deflecting any inquiry that ventured too close to his past. He was a man who had clearly mastered the art of revealing nothing. After Sterling retired, Magnolia expected Cale to vanish into the night. Instead, he remained a solid, silent presence near the doorway as she cleared the table. She could feel the warmth of him, a steady anchor in the room's lingering discomfort. When she turned, she found his dark eyes watching her, his expression unreadable yet intensely focused. She told him he didn't have to endure these meals for show, that she knew how uncomfortable it was for him. His reply was quiet, meant for her alone. He said that her father would take his refusal as an insult, and that would make things harder for her. The simple, profound consideration in those words struck her deeply. He was thinking of her position, of the repercussions she would face from her own father. It was a level of empathy she would not have expected, a nobility that had nothing to do with her father's loud proclamations of honor. It was in that quiet moment, surrounded by the simple wreckage of a supper, that a fragile but genuine trust began to knit itself together between them, born not from grand gestures, but from a shared understanding of their impossible situation. The fragile peace shattered with the thunder of hooves, a sound that was becoming dreadfully familiar. Yet this time, it carried a sharper, more vicious edge. They came at dusk, when the copper sky offered a deceptive calm, a dozen riders moving with a coordinated speed that spoke of vengeance and a lesson to be taught. Magnolia saw them first from a window, a dark, swift-moving stain against the horizon, and her instincts screamed a warning before her mind could fully process the sight. She ran for the rifle, her shouts for her father, and Cale raw with a panic she could no longer control. Sterling emerged from his room, boots half on, his face a mask of sleep-dulled confusion quickly transforming into terror. Cale appeared from the barn not as a man startled, but as a force unleashed, his entire being radiating a focused, predatory intensity that made it clear he had been expecting this very moment. The raiders split their force with tactical precision, one group circling toward the house with guns drawn, the other driving straight for the corral where their remaining cattle, their last shred of hope, stood listlessly. The first gunshots cracked through the evening, splintering the wooden porch, raiding and kicking up dust at Magnolia's feet. She dropped behind the water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sterling returned fire from the doorway, but his shots were wild, his hands trembling with a fear that was as much for his dying legacy as for his life. They were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, a fact that hung in the air as palpably as the smell of gunpowder. Cale moved through the chaos like a ghost, a fluid, purposeful shadow, using the barn and the dying light as his allies. He wasn't trying to win a battle against impossible odds. He was disrupting, creating confusion, forcing the raiders to react to him instead of executing their plan with cold efficiency. His every movement was economical and deadly, a dance of survival he knew all too well. One of the raiders broke away from the main group, his target clear, as he charged directly toward the house and the exposed figure of Magnolia behind the trough. She raised her rifle, but her hands shook so violently the sight wavered uselessly. The man was 20 paces away, then 15, then 10, his intent to kill written plainly in his eyes. Her finger tightened on the trigger, her breath caught in her throat. Just as the man raised his own weapon, Cale materialized from the side in a blur of motion, tackling him with brutal force. They went down hard, a tangle of limbs and violence in the churned-up dirt. In the struggle, Magnolia saw the glint of steel, a blade flashing in the fading light. Acting on pure instinct, she fired, not at the men, but into the ground beside them. The explosion of dirt and noise was enough. The raider flinched, his grip loosening for a critical second, and Cale used the opening to disarm him, sending the man scrambling backward toward his horse with a vicious shove. But the diversion came at a terrible cost. While Cale was engaged, 3 other raiders reached the corral. The sound of splintering was followed by the frantic bawling of cattle as they cut the fence and drove the terrified animals out into the open land. Sterling shouted, a raw, guttural cry of rage and utter despair, but it was a useless protest against the inevitable. He could only watch, his shoulders slumping, as the last of his wealth, his reason for being, was scattered into the gathering darkness by the very men he had feared. The raiders vanished as quickly as they had come, leaving behind in silence that was heavier and more profound than the gunfire. Sterling stood motionless in the center of the yard, a broken figure staring at the empty corral and the shattered fence. In the span of 10 minutes, his world had been erased. The debt he had claimed was so sacred had been paid in the most cruel currency possible: total ruin. Magnolia's eyes left her father's devastating stillness and found Cale, who was slowly getting to his feet, his breathing ragged. A dark, wet streak stained the shoulder of his shirt, the fabric torn where the raider's blade had found its mark. He was hurt, and the sight of his blood shed for her, cut through the last of her reservations. She ran to him, her own fear forgotten. Her hand reached out without permission, her fingers gently touching the torn fabric around the wound. He flinched at the contact, a reflex of a man unused to being touched, but he did not pull away. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, the weight of battles fought for people who were not his own, for a land that was not his home. "You're hurt," she said, her voice quiet but firm, no longer shaking. He tried to dismiss it, but the words lacked any conviction. "Let me help," she stated, and it was not a request. It was a declaration. In that moment, covered in the dust of the fight and the shared residue of fear, something fundamental shifted irrevocably within her. She was no longer defending him out of principle or a sense of fairness. She was defending him, tending to him, because he had placed himself between her and violence without a second thought. He had fought for them when he had every reason to walk away, and he had done it anyway. As Sterling walked past them into the house, a hollowed-out shell of the man he had been, Magnolia led Cale toward the lamplight, her hand a steady guide on his uninjured arm, her own heart finally, undeniably, overcoming all resistance. The lamplight in the kitchen threw long, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the turmoil within the room. Magnolia worked with a quiet efficiency, cleaning the long, shallow gash on Cale's shoulder with a cloth and water. He sat rigid in the chair, his jaw a hard line of suppressed pain, his eyes fixed on the far wall. Behind him, Sterling Maddock sat at the rough-hewn table, his face buried in his work-roughened hands, his broad shoulders slumped in a posture of absolute defeat. The silence was a heavy shroud, broken only by the soft sounds of Magnolia's ministrations and the ragged intake of Sterling's breath. When the wound was clean and bandaged, Cale stood, a clear intention to retreat into the night written in the stiff set of his body. But a single word, raw and thick with emotion, stopped him in his tracks. "Wait." Sterling looked up, and his eyes were red-rimmed, the eyes of a man who had stared into an abyss of his own making. He gestured for them both to sit, his voice a broken version of its former authority, pleading rather than commanding. They sat, Magnolia with a fresh coil of tension in her stomach, waiting for another declaration, another edict born of his implacable pride. What came out, however, was not a decree, but a confession, whispered into the lamplight as if speaking it aloud might finally exorcise the ghost that had haunted him for years. He spoke of another daughter, a child Magnolia had never known she had. Her name was Catherine. He described a girl of 17, full of life, who had dared to fall in love with a man he deemed unworthy, a wanderer, a trapper with no land and no name to offer. Sterling had forbidden the match, wielding his authority like a weapon, telling her she would dishonor the family, that she owed him her obedience. He had laid down his law with the unyielding certainty he had just tried to use on Magnolia. Catherine, possessed of a spirit he had failed to break, had defied him. She had left, married the man she loved, and Sterling, in his wrath and pride, had made good on his threat. He had cut her off completely, casting her out and ensuring the entire territory knew that anyone who helped the young couple would be siding against him. His voice cracked, shattering under the weight of the memory. 2 years later, word had come back. A fever had taken her during a brutal winter. Her husband had tried to get help, had tried to bring her to safety, but the doors had been closed to them, barred by Sterling's pride. He looked directly at Cale, his face a landscape of torment, and uttered the terrible truth he had carried alone. He had killed his daughter not with a weapon, but with his pride, his honor, his rigid traditions. He confessed that every action since, every stubborn insistence on debt and honor, had been a desperate, twisted attempt to prove to his own shattered soul that his way was right, that control and obedience could somehow lead to a happiness he had destroyed. The silence that followed was absolute, the truth hanging in the air between them, terrible and liberating. Cale was the one who finally spoke, his voice low and quiet, but the words cut with the precision of a surgeon's blade. He stated the simple, devastating fact that Sterling could not fix the past by repeating the same mistake. The old man flinched as if struck, the truth of the statement washing over him in a final, cleansing wave. He turned to Magnolia, and for the first time, she saw not a patriarch, but a frightened, broken man terrified of history repeating itself. He admitted he was wrong. He was wrong about the debt, wrong about the marriage, wrong in thinking he could force honor into existence through obligation and control. He looked at Cale, his apology spilling out, sincere and broken. He acknowledged that the man who had saved their lives, who had fought beside them, owed them nothing, and that his own attempts at repayment had been just another form of theft, the theft of freedom. The heavy weight that had pressed down on the room for days seemed to lift, allowing a new, tentative air to enter. Magnolia felt as if she could breathe fully for the first time since this nightmare had begun. The forced ceremony, the obligation, the debt, it was all over. They were free. With the weight of obligation lifted, the air in the kitchen should have felt light, but instead it grew thick with a new, unspoken tension. Sterling retreated to his room, leaving them alone, the echo of his confession a ghost in the space between them. The single lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to pulse with the uncertainty of the moment. Cale stood, the movement signaling his intent to depart, to melt back into the landscape from which he had come, a free man with no chains to hold him. But as he turned to go, Magnolia's hand shot out, her fingers closing around his wrist with a sudden, desperate certainty. The contact was electric, a jolt that stilled them both. He looked down at her, his dark eyes wide with surprise, the usual guarded mask momentarily shattered. She did not let go. She held on, her grip firm, an anchor in the shifting tides of their newfound freedom. She finally released him, her voice quiet but unwavering in the semi-darkness. She told him he was free to leave, that there was no debt, no arrangement binding him. He could saddle his horse and ride out at first light and never look back, his conscience clear. He studied her face in the wavering light, his gaze searching for something deeper than words, and then he asked the question that changed everything. He asked her if that was what she truly wanted. The question hung in the air, heavy and profound, stripping away all pretense. Magnolia took a breath, gathering a courage that felt different from facing raiders or defying her father. This was a vulnerability chosen, not forced. Her answer was a soft, solid no. She did not want him to leave, but not for any reason her father had ever shouted about. It had nothing to do with honor, debt, or tradition. It was because somewhere in the chaos of being trapped together and fighting side by side, she had begun to see the man beneath the silence and the strength. She wanted the chance to know him, to understand the person he was when no one was forcing him to be anything at all. But only she insisted if he wanted it too. Cale's expression underwent a profound transformation. The rigid control he wore like armor cracked, revealing the war raging within him. She could see the instinct to flee, to protect himself from the danger of connection, battling against a deeper, more powerful desire. When he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he had long suppressed. He confessed to a life spent running from attachments, from places and people that made him care, because caring always led to loss. It was a lesson carved into his soul by a past he never detailed. But he continued, his gaze locked with hers. When the raiders had attacked, every instinct, every lesson had vanished. All that remained was a single, driving need to keep her safe, not for a debt, not for honor, but because the thought of any harm coming to her was unbearable. It was a truth that cost him everything to admit. Magnolia felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a wild, hopeful rhythm. She closed the small distance between them until she could feel the warmth of his body and see the conflict in his eyes. She did not ask for forever or promises they might not be ready to make. She asked only that he stay to see what could blossom between them when it was born from choice, not demand. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he raised his hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, brushed against her cheek with a gentleness that belied their power. He whispered that he didn't know how to be anything other than alone. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming to rest over his, and told him she didn't either. But she would rather learn together than spend the rest of her life wondering what they might have been if they had been brave enough to try. For a long moment, they stood there, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, the tension slowly seeping from his frame as he exhaled a burden he had carried for a lifetime. Then came the whisper, a vow more binding than any forced ceremony. I'll stay, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And in that simple voluntary declaration, the forced arrangement shattered completely, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating foundation of a future they would build themselves, brick by careful brick, beginning with that single conscious choice.